So what impact have the events of this week had on the Prime Minister's popularity? And joining me now is Joe Twyman, founder of Delta Poll. Joe, it's been quite a week. I can't remember a week like it for quite some time. So what impact has this had on the Prime Minister's standing and indeed on the government standing?
Well, in terms of the short-term impact, it's been substantial. And we've seen the poll from YouGov yesterday and another poll earlier in the week that showed that the Labour Party have moved ahead beyond the margin of error now, ahead of the Conservatives. This is an acceleration of the trend that we've seen over recent weeks as this series of events, whether it's Owen Paterson, whether it's Wallpaper Gate, whether it's Barnard Castle, as these series of events have continued. But the key question is what long-term impact will it have? Many of your viewers will be saying, well, does this actually matter? Well, this individual event probably doesn't. The question of Downing Street Party is not the kind of thing that's going to sway someone one way or the other. But the cumulative effect of all these things that we've talked about could start forming a narrative in the minds of many voters that the Conservatives cannot be trusted, they don't act fairly, and they don't act in an equal way. One will rule for them, one will for others. But then in the, if you like, short to medium term, it could also have an impact in terms of how people approach the new rules that are coming into place. A large proportion of people, nearly 3/4 of people, support the new rules in principle, but whether they actually behave and follow them could now be brought into question by the Prime Minister's behaviour, but also it gives MPs on the backbenches of the Conservative Party an opportunity to rebel as well, because they're upset at the situation. So it's made things very, very messy. But at least he's had another child.
Absolutely. And of course, we wish him well with all of that, and Carrie as well. I mean, you talk about Barnard Castle. Of course, that was the first big issue for this government, if you may think back to that time when Dominic Cummings went to Durham. Did that have an impact on the polls at that particular point in time? And how long did it take for the Conservatives to come back into place if it did have an impact?
Well, it did have a short-term impact, definitely. But let's play a game and imagine it hadn't happened. Could you see the polls being significantly different from where they are now? Probably not. They'd probably be around the same place. What happened was the vaccine programme started and everything else around COVID really captured the public imagination, in a bad way, of course. And that really dominated the way that people were thinking about things. And so individual events like that, yes, they had a short-term effect, but not a long-term one.
So you're saying to me, really, it's the fact that all of these other events have happened quite quickly together, starting with Owen Paterson, if I can put it like that, and then moving on to Wallpaper Gate, coming back again, then the parties in Downing Street. It all seems to be coming together. That is what's happening in terms of the polls at the moment, because this is the first time we've seen, as you've said, beyond the margin of error, really, isn't it?
As a pollster, what I'm interested in are the long-term trends. And what drives the long-term trends are these turning points rather than talking points. And each one of these individual things is an interesting talking point. But it's the cumulative effect of all of them, Barnard Castle included, that helps inform the way that we think about parties and leaders. And the stories that we tell ourselves and each other about those parties informs how we vote. And certainly those stories have been very negative and in quick succession over recent weeks.
And I'm going to use a phrase now that I hate, but other people are using it, so that's why I'm going to use it. You're saying, really, it has cut through to voters that ordinarily might say, oh, that's a Westminster story, we're not going to bother about that. This is actually cutting through. And I suppose an indication of that has been the fact that Ant and Dec are talking about it on their programme, and it's now become a bit of a laugh. And no government official wants to be a bit of a laugh. Not even Boris.
Not even Boris all the time. You can define cut through in many different ways, but certainly I think for this particular story, it's clear that it's resonated beyond the usual suspects, beyond the Westminster bubble, and quote unquote the average person and the 50% of people less engaged than the average person in the street are listening and hearing about this story in perhaps a way they wouldn't around something like Wallpaper Gate, for instance. It really does seem to have resonated. Now, that doesn't mean that the effects will last, but it does seem to have resonated, at least for now.
Yeah, and I want to talk to you about that because, of course, in politics, it's all about events. And there are quite some big events happening. The migration story, and we have covered it many Fridays on this show about those illegal immigrants coming from France into Britain. Obviously, the weather's very bad at the moment in the Channel. There hasn't been as many coming across this week, but that has the propensity to come back. We have the issues on the Ukrainian border with the Russians amassing there, and we've covered that quite a lot today on GB News. Of course, we also have COVID. And dare I mention the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is a particular favourite of mine, as you can imagine. So there are quite a few things that could happen that could take things in a different direction. Am I right about that?
You're right. The Northern Ireland Protocol is, of course, very important to some people within the United Kingdom.
Some very important people.
Some important people, but a relatively, I might say, relatively small number. Migration and other issues really are all playing second fiddle to COVID and have done now for the last really 2 years. And so that is something that is really dominating the agenda. And what we've seen consistently throughout the pandemic is that support for the government generally and for Boris Johnson specifically has correlated very closely with whether people perceive the government is doing a good or bad job in dealing with the pandemic. Now, that was a link that had, if not broken, then certainly diminished over the last few weeks. But with the rise of Omicron and focus once again returning to questions around lockdowns and rules, inevitably then the public focus returns to that, and that's where we are. The question is, in the new year, we'll have to see exactly what the impact of this new variant has, and whether that means we can move back to something resembling normal circumstances where we start to think as a nation about other things, or whether that remains the focus for the foreseeable future.
And of course, I haven't even mentioned the economy and how we're doing in terms of creating jobs and growth, which is normally the thing that we're talking about in terms of a government doing well. Is that something that might give him good news in the new year, or is it something that he should be concerned about as well?
Well, a bit of both, really. Boris Johnson, in our poll last weekend, Delta Poll's poll showed that Boris Johnson and the Conservatives were still seen as the better of the two main parties on the economy, which is, of course, traditionally such an important metric. But we have issues around the cost of living, energy prices and so on and so forth, which could cause implications, along, of course, with taxation and public spending and all the questions around that. So there's a lot of difficult times ahead for the Conservatives. And the last thing they would want going into Christmas is, firstly, the threat of another lockdown for Christmas, which they would want to avoid. And secondly, all this other stuff, if you like, unrelated to policy, but instead calling into question the very character of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister.
And only a few weeks ago, we were spending a lot of time talking about climate change and how we were going to combat climate change and all of that. And that all seems to have gone off the agenda because of everything else that's going on. Do you think that that is something that will come back again in terms of the Conservative Party? Because you mentioned the cost of living. And of course, climate change is linked to that, and energy supplies. So will that come again in the new year?
I expect it to. It's definitely a second-tier issue at the moment behind COVID and short-term health implications. So as those diminish, I imagine it will rise back up the agenda. But when that happens, remains to be seen, because we don't know how things will develop with the new variant or variants to come after that. Yeah,
and indeed, we don't know what's going to happen on that Ukrainian border either, because if there is an incursion, as some people fear that there's going to be by Russia, I would imagine that that'll become a huge story at that point as well.
Absolutely, but how that impacts on voting intention will be interesting, because generally speaking, public policy decisions when it comes to foreign policy don't have a massive impact. But this could be a massive story, so we will have to wait and see.
Well, Joe, we've covered a lot of ground there, and I think we'll be talking about this for a lot longer as well. So thank you so much for coming in and having that conversation with me today.